Order, order. Thank you very much for coming to give evidence to our Select Committee this morning on supporting regional investment and growth. And this is the first oral evidence session that we're taking on this, and we very much welcome the three of you today to talk about regional growth, particularly in the north of England in your respective areas. We'll start the questions this morning with Sir Patrick.
Thank you, Chair. I think, Henry, if we can start, I think this perhaps comes to you first, but anybody else can contribute if they so wish. It's now 5 years since the Northern Powerhouse was launched. What would you say has been its impact and value added? What it has done for the region?
I think the main benefit of having that collaboration between civic leaders, now more and more local enterprise partnerships with government and business, has been that it's given more focus to the challenges which do exist in the north. So I think it was Sir Richard Leese, who's the leader of Manchester, talks often about the kind of time horizon we're talking about is decades rather than months, right? It's going to take a long time to close that north-south divide. The Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review showed a 22,500 gap between kind of your average person in the south and those in the north when you look at families, and that is a massive disparity. And there's also a disparity between the rest of England and the north of England. So what I think the Northern Powerhouse has done is begun a series of conversations which will lead to addressing that and some intermediate steps. So I think the establishment of Metro Mayors has been a very significant area of progress, has brought real benefits. The establishment of Transport for the North, which means we can start to address our shared infrastructure challenges, the first Northern Powerhouse integrated transport strategy, which is in reality an economic strategy with some transport actions, and linked to that particularly Northern Powerhouse Rail, which has gone from being 5 years ago a line in a speech in Manchester to being a project that the Department of Transport, you're very well aware, was progressed very strongly and then has now got to the point where it is widely accepted to be a priority for either of the two leadership candidates who will be the next Prime Minister. So I think the Northern Powerhouse has definitely had an impact. What I wouldn't say is that it has overnight changed the north of England, but I don't think it ever was going to do that. And I think that particularly around the industrial strategy, because it takes a national lens and because local industrial strategies have taken longer, not come first but come second, I'd say in industrial policy, despite the commitment of those like Greg Clark at BEIS to this issue, I think sometimes the progress has been patchy. And on those four prime capabilities of energy, digital, health innovation, and the kind of manufacturing sectors, the North has got some clear opportunities to drive progress in those sectors. And I would say that sometimes national policy, for instance in energy, has held us back. And that's why I'd say there are some very similar priorities from ourselves and the MP11 group of Northern LEPs, because we're zeroing in on those areas where national policy is a barrier, but also where there's a lack of the right tools to the job and a lack of investment in what the local industrial strategies need to deliver. So if there is only a plan and no money behind it, then we're not going to get the progress we need. And I think that is an area where, in the context of Brexit, there is a lot of uncertainty, and I think over the session, I'm sure we'll probe those areas, but there's a lot more detail that needs to be put on this agenda for it to genuinely address the scale of ambition that George Osborne set up as Chancellor then, and the lack of momentum that happened when the current Prime Minister first took office has been somewhat addressed, but we still need to go further, and that's why those like our regional newspapers are still campaigning very vociferously for more progress.
I think to add to that, I'd just like to echo the point on realism on pace. You know, the North has probably been preeminent 4 times in history, the War of the Roses, the Industrial Revolution, and we're not going to turn down decades of disparity in a few years. So for me, the Northern Powerhouse is a really, really important mechanism to bring together all of the key parties to focus on the issues that really matter to the North, and to lobby collectively, because lots of separate deals are not helpful for the North in its entirety unless we have something that goes across that and represents all areas and all interests. Otherwise, we're in danger of creating a two-tier economy in the North, which isn't helpful to the UK.
Would you say that the Northern Powerhouse strategy is inclusive of all of the North? Because we're talking about a very, very different sort of area from sort of central Manchester to Cumbria. And do you think there is an acceptance that the Northern Powerhouse is actually looking after the region as opposed to being something which is just really Manchester and Liverpool trying to edge everybody else out?
Well, I love all of our places in the north, so I start with that point. But for me, we've got to be clear that the Northern Powerhouse focuses on those issues that matter to everybody, irrespective of their geography and issues. So Henry's talked about the sort of 4 themes in the economic review. In addition, I think there are some things that are genuinely issues that we can address on a pan-northern basis. And for me, that's very much about transport, it's about innovation, and it's about trade and investment, and how we work collectively to promote those issues. I think beyond that, we've got to be really, really clear, and it's exactly the point that you make, Sir Patrick. Places are very different, and they need genuinely place-based strategy, investment, and solution, and bespoke solutions.
Okay. How now accepted is the Northern Powerhouse as a deliverer as opposed to a talking shop? So, you know, how much have you tied in Leeds, Sheffield with the whole concept?
So I'd say, we would say from particularly a business perspective, there's the very highest level of support. So what we uniquely find as an organisation that's made up of predominantly business leaders but also civic leaders is that we have almost universal support from the major business people in the north of England. And I think there's very few policy areas where you can say the business community is as absolutely united as, and that's across all sectors. So from a Sellafield in Cumbria to a Sirius Minerals in Scarborough, in James's Patch. Very different businesses, but they absolutely see how their individual business is part of this agenda, how the education and skills challenge affects them, how some of the transport issues affect them. I think what I'd say around the kind of places is there is absolutely a challenge around the variable speed of devolution. And I think that the nature of the deal-making process was that means that some areas have worked on that direction faster than others, and that does create some inequities, and those do cause tension. So although Northern Powerhouse Rail is delivered on a pan-northern basis through Transport for North, Joe quite rightly referred to those areas which are not going to be delivered on a pan-northern basis. But Jim O'Neill, when he's previously given evidence to other committees, has been very clear. The ingredients for the Northern Powerhouse to succeed also include things like devolution, which are delivered in places, not just the things you do at a pan-northern level. So if you want to rebalance the economy, there are a limited number of things like sorting out schools and sorting out transport you can do across the north. But the majority of the impact you're going to have to make will be at the level of those functional economic geographies. And at the moment, the reality is you don't have the same levers in Leeds City region, which is the geographically largest bit of the north, right in the centre of it, that, say, the Mayor in Greater Manchester has. And that's why there is an aspiration for a devolution settlement in Yorkshire. And I think we need to also think about what devolution would look like in non-city-based clusters, because in reality, we're now at the point where half the north has got devolution. We're pushing, and government policy is still to push for devolution to be extended yet further. But the reality is the type of model and the type of powers people might want will be different in different places. And in a parliament with very limited ability to change legislation, we do have concerns that the model of devolution might not necessarily be fit for purpose for the places that haven't yet taken advantage of it. And that does cause some tensions in the system because people have got something on the table. Now, there are some like Cheshire and Warrington that could just take a mayor tomorrow and have asked for a mayor tomorrow. And I do sometimes despair with government that although Jake Berry as the minister is very keen to support us, that across the cabinet table there has just been a lack of incentive to move on devolution, no devolution framework yet. And that has frustrated an awful lot of people in the north of England who have wanted to embrace the devolution movement, could accept the current model with all of the political challenges for local government leaders in accepting an elected mayor, but simply because of the lack of commitment from the cabinet have not been able to collectively make progress. And I think that is a frustration.
Can we just dig that a bit further? How much common agreement is there, and how much is government holding back the concept then of elected mayors? In what areas could you have elected mayors which at the moment you're not being able to have?
So I would say that the Cheshire and Warrington is the best example. So Cheshire and Warrington has got a very high performing economy. It's geographically located between two city mayors. At various times the council leaders have come to government and asked for a mayor. In fact, they asked the first time, they've been back and asked again. But government just hasn't had the bandwidth to properly support them. And I think what we need to see from the next Prime Minister is a real commitment to devolution, because I think what is frustrating is there's lots of talk about the northern transport issues, but if you don't have, for instance, an answer to education and skills can only be done at the level of functional economic geography, then you're not going to make progress on rebalancing the economy, because all you'll do is take the limited number of people with high skills to the bigger cities, and you'll just create bigger skills disparities in those places that are economically currently more marginal. So you've got to address the fundamental causes, not simply help cities attract more people, which is what on its own TFN's plan would do if you don't invest in skills.
Joe?
Yorkshire is well rehearsed at a national level as another area where locally you have commitment and agreement to move towards Yorkshire, but as we stand at present day, obviously government have not quite shut the door, but they've said it's something down the line and we need to move towards it. But again, we have Sheffield who've got a mayor, we've got Leeds who don't, from that, so the largest city, the only core city without a mayor from that perspective, and you've got York and North Yorkshire and the Humber who are very coherent and kind of want to move forward. So Yorkshire, whether it's in a two-stage process or a one-stage process, needs to make progress, and it needs to make progress quickly.
Could I just add something on devolution? I think we've got to avoid being obsessed by structural devolution and instead focus on investment devolution, because we entered a world where for creating certain structures the reward was a deal. It's not really entirely necessary, and if I look at the borderlands, the heads of terms were signed earlier this week. There has been no structural change. There has just been an agreement that partners will work together productively, develop a strategy and develop clear governance mechanisms to make that work. So not all areas are as easy to move to a structural devolution model, and it's very important those areas don't get left behind. And I'm offering this from my previous life in the whole of the North West.
Now, as you said earlier on, Jake Berry is the Minister for the Northern Powerhouse, and I think he does a very effective job. He represents a constituency in the North. Who do you regard as the Cabinet Minister responsible for the Northern Powerhouse?
I'd say that the current two individuals that take the most interest and been the most supportive have been the Transport Secretary, Chris Grayling, for obvious reasons, because there have been some significant challenges in the North, and that has brought him to spend more time on it, I would say. And the Chancellor, who the current Chancellor does take this agenda very seriously and is currently reviewing the business case for Northern Powerhouse Rail and other parts of the Transport for the North plan. So I would say that the current Chancellor, and he's probably, I think, the only member of the Cabinet to actually go and meet the mayors, for instance. So Ben Hatchen, when they were first elected in the North, who's the Mayor of Tees Valley, and then the two Labour mayors on the other side of the country, Steve Rotherham and Andy Burnham, met with the Chancellor to have a conversation. I don't think the Prime Minister's ever done that. She's never come to the North and met them. And I think that either you have, as the Yorkshire Post has argued, a Cabinet Minister with specific responsibility for the Northern Powerhouse, or you need a Prime Minister who takes a much more active interest in this agenda. And I think the challenge was in this government, clearly, perhaps domestic delivery has been slower anyway across the board. And so even though we may have had notional support in a number of areas, progress has been very slow. And there hasn't been that cross-government collaboration that we maybe needed to see. I think there has been a lot more goodwill in the last few months. And I think that particularly on transport, Chris Grayling's not always very popular in the pages of our local newspapers. But I'd say on issues like seriously engaging with Northern Powerhouse Rail, I'd say he has been a good advocate for the North of England. I think what you then have an issue about is that still too many decisions are made in London, and so all of the kind of friction you see between the northern leaders and government is partly because devolution to Transport for the North is nowhere near far enough. And if you're going to have a transport body for the North of England, they need to have real responsibility for the infrastructure and the services, and at the moment they have neither. So what you see in the media is lots of quite legitimate criticism of government not delivering on the detail, when in reality if you trusted the mayors and the elected civic leaders in the North to take these decisions for themselves, rather than having to come and criticise the government for not acting on an issue, they'd have the powers to do it themselves. And I think that what you need is a champion around government to move powers out of Westminster, because in the end, however good and effective government you are, you're never going to do as good a job as those who are closer to the detail of what will drive these economies. And that partnership between government and grown-up civic leaders working on a cross-party basis with business is exactly what has defined the Northern Powerhouse, I would argue. And we could go a lot further in making that a reality if government released more of the funding in areas like skills, for instance, education, where the Department for Education has been woeful, right, in terms of actually letting go, taking years longer to do skills devolution. That just isn't good enough.
Joe, did you want to
Sorry.
I mean, in terms of the... sorry, I'll come back. I'll let James go.
I'll just say, if you look at what business wants is they want certainty, and they want to see long-term investment plans. what you get through effective devolution is you get the local transport priorities, as Henry kind of talked about from that perspective, but you also get a very clear picture of where the funding is coming from over a long period of time. Whilst it is controlled from Whitehall, it's all subject to change, and you don't get that consistency and that certainty. So the importance of devolution is so that business can have that confidence to make the right investments, and it knows that the public sector is going to step up and deliver the long-term ambitions.
Yeah. The point I was going to make is, for me, there is something about who is the sponsor person for the North, and I think it's a really important point that you raise. For me, government at this point in time is probably more centralised and siloed than it's ever been. So if I think back to even recent history, in the past decade, government had serious regional presence. They had regional ministers who were working across Whitehall and Westminster to champion the particular needs of those places. Now it's not like that. All of our conversations tend to be very productive and positive, but extremely siloed. And if we are talking about placemaking and place shaping, it genuinely needs a collaborative government approach. So I think there's a really good point about who are the regional champions in government.
I think, given my own experience, there was no doubt when I was in the cabinet that George Osborne was driving it and driving it incredibly ruthlessly as Chancellor, and all arms of government therefore knew that there was going to be progress made. I was slightly surprised by the answers you gave to me on that. You never mentioned Greg Clark. You did mention Damien Hines. Sort of slightly no progress is being made, but James Brokenshire also was not highlighted. So that was quite an interesting response. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I just ask, Henry Morrison, what model do you propose for Yorkshire devolution, or are you agnostic?
So it's a matter, I would argue, for the democratically elected leaders of Yorkshire, and I'll be going to see them next week at their invitation to discuss their current plans. I think I would make the case that, very much as James outlined as one of the kind of partners, and the local enterprise partners absolutely are partners to this, that you need to find a model that will work for everyone. So the democratic aspiration, as shown by a couple of plebiscites as well in Doncaster and Barnsley, is to achieve one Yorkshire. The only way to achieve that is to complete the deal in the Sheffield City region, to show government good faith that previous commitments made by those councils will be met, and then also to consider what sort of transitional arrangements and funding could be applied in West Yorkshire before you'd have time to elect a new mayor of Yorkshire. So I think my point would be that I think all those involved need to show good faith, and that means that if there is a model that can attract broad-based support, then that is the one that will need to be taken forward. At the moment, there are some slight differences of opinion, for instance in Sheffield and Rotherham, who prefer their current Sheffield City region proposal, and the model they've already signed up to a government. And I think it's only by making some progress on that deal and also securing funding for West Yorkshire, because regardless of whether you've got a mayor or not, the reality is there are, as we've alluded to, priorities that need to be delivered against in that area. And before there is a one Yorkshire mayor, if that is the eventual model, there has to be a funding settlement in the interim. And so I think if you look at Manchester, actually, it's not always an example people in Yorkshire look to because it's considered to be a very different model. There were a number of devolution deals before the final mayoral deal, and I would draw a parallel to say that government need to think about what the steps are to mayoral devolution, if that's still what government would like for Yorkshire, if that's what they're prepared to work towards, and see how those intermediate steps could start to unlock economic growth. And I think those are, because it's not a question for me, Rachel, I couldn't tell you what the right answer is, but I think that the current impasse is of the making of government not being prepared to be flexible enough at times, and also those in South Yorkshire maybe not showing enough good faith in collaborating together, and that has caused some real issues. And I sympathise very much with the Mayor of the Sheffield City region, Dan Jarvis, who's been trying to make progress both on his own deal as the current Mayor, but also on a future One Yorkshire settlement, and I think him and others have tried in good faith to make progress.
But you think government should be more... They're very wedded at the moment to these city region deals. You think there's a case for, if that's what the local community and leaders want, to look at, for example, devolution to a region rather than just a city deal, if that's what local people want?
I think it has to be. I think it has to be considered, Rachel. I think there are strong arguments for some degree of local economic geography still being a component of how deals are structured. But I think the lack of willingness to make any change to the legislation, I think, has probably caused some of this, which is that you would have to make probably some changes to pursue regional devolution. But at the moment, government hasn't got a parliamentary majority to get that sort of stuff through. So even if there was a solution to look at alternative models, it's pretty much ruled out.
And then one thing that you mentioned as well, Henry, was around skills. And 20, 30 years ago, problems in London schools were very much on the political agenda, and the London Challenge was used to turn around London schools. You've spoken about skills. Is it some sort of model like that for schools and FE potentially as well, and adult education, where we need some model a little bit like that to turn things around and ensure that not just that we get the skills of the businesses, but that everybody can benefit from a renaissance in the north of England?
So I think one of the things the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, led by Susan Hinchcliffe, have rightly argued for is essentially devolution by default of the area of the adult skills budget. So this is the budget that took years to devolve in Manchester. In reality, I don't see an argument for why you have to have a mayor to be able to devolve that budget. Yeah. It's spent so ineffectively by central government that I don't think anybody could do worse, regardless of whether they've got a mayor or not.
Thank you.
And I think linked to that, if you had a northern-wide schools challenge that across the whole north, I think that would make a real difference. Rachel.
Thank you. I'll bring in Jo very briefly, then we'd better move on to the next question.
I was just going to say, I mean, the London Challenge was a massive, massive investment in educational performance. So I think we've got to look at what were the component factors within that and how do you replicate that in different places.
Thank you. Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, I'm talking really about the area, the subject matter of the question that I would like to ask. I mean, I'm a Scottish Member of Parliament, obviously, and we've been on a 20-year evolutionary journey with devolution, and many of the frustrations that you feel, I think, perhaps Drew and I can relate to. The asymmetrical devolution, it can actually be a strategic strength for this country, but the problem is it does appear to be made up as we go along. Would you agree with that? It does seem to be a lot of ad hocery around what we do. There doesn't seem to be a model that, you know, allows gradual release of further and further powers. It all seems...
We've been waiting for the devolution framework now for forever. And
There's just no framework.
We continue to wait. So if you want some consistency, you have to have a framework with which to work with. Yeah. And so couldn't agree more from that perspective, is provide a framework, and not the North.
And then there isn't a framework within Whitehall either to cope with devolution. It's almost as devolution happened and Whitehall just carried on.
Absolutely.
Certainly from a Scottish perspective, it often feels that way as well. I mean, what would in Yorkshire, in the case of Yorkshire, what would the gold standard for Yorkshire be in terms of devolution?
Well, I think the critical thing about devolution, and it's kind of what Joe said, it's about right decisions at the right level. So clearly the aspiration, the political aspiration in Yorkshire is one Yorkshire devolution. And the fact that you've got alignment across 18 of the 20 authorities in Yorkshire, you've got very strong political alignment with a one Yorkshire devolution. You've got the strength of brand from a local resident perspective through to the business perspective, right through to the politicians. You have buy-in to that, to Yorkshire and the Yorkshire concept. And it also provides you with the scale to compete internationally. If you look at your most effective international regions, they operate at scale. And it needs to be at the very least Yorkshire, if not the north of England, when we're looking to compete with regard to the international regions.
So help me understand something. So from a Scottish perspective again,
yes.
Why is there so little appetite for a legislative devolutionary framework for Yorkshire?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I think, you know, ultimately you've got to start somewhere. What we have is we have the local authorities across the whole of Yorkshire lined up, wanting to go in a direction. We have government which is currently reluctant to do that.
Yeah.
We need to bridge that gap in whatever way to get to first base in real terms, so that we can then move forward from that perspective.
So are you saying that without the devolution framework that we've both identified as missing, that it's hard to define what gold standard would be for Yorkshire?
I think it is, yes, absolutely. If you don't know what you're playing with, you don't know what the best... I mean, ultimately, obviously, transport's something which is really important. We've talked before about skills, trade and investment. These are all things which are absolutely critical at a local level, and decisions need to be made locally. You cannot make those decisions out of Whitehall and make effective decisions and leverage the most private sector investment that you've got. So as a very basic level, there are three things there which must be part of the devolution deal. Yeah,
and when we think about Cumbria, when I think of Cumbria, I think of the very rural part of England. I mean, devolution in Ross terms is power in the communities where people live. I mean, should we not have started devolution in rural areas?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because most of the deals, and it's the point we made earlier, are focused on cities. And it's really important that we've got things that work in all of our geographies, particularly around devolution. So I think that's a really, really important point. For me, if we were looking at gold standard, it would be very much, Stephen, focusing on investment devolution as opposed to structural devolution.
Can you explain a little bit more about what?
Well, for me, we've been operating, and this is very much about investment and growth, we've been operating the two largest investment vehicles for this agenda have worked in ways that has made them probably more difficult to bring together funding-wise than at any point in time. So our growth deal was entirely capital, and during Sir Patrick's time we had brilliant investment in the growth deal from the Department for Transport, genuinely. So very, very focused on infrastructure and capital investment.
Yeah.
European programmes were very much focused on revenue and looking at different investment streams. So trying to make those work cohesively in place was fairly challenging. So for me, it's how do we create an integrated pot that is very much about the specific things that should be devolved to a local area and looking at how collectively public and private partners do that with very, very targeted interventions on the issues that matter most in place. Because without knowing place, you cannot make the best investment decisions.
And all of this is underpinned by this kind of spirit of collaboration that you describe at all levels of
at
government.
all levels. And government's current vehicle, I would say this, for economic investment is the local enterprise partnerships, which across England do exist and cover every geography, and work very, very closely with their public sector partners and their devolution partners.
And I think place is the important part in this. The strength or the opportunity of the industrial strategy is it talks very heavily about distinctive places. And that's what we need. We need successful, distinctive places. And that means you need to be able to integrate what you're doing with transport, with what you're doing with skills.
Across
and the
business,
region,
across the nation.
So whilst, even within the growth deal, whilst we welcome the growth deal, it was really significant investment, it was still, you have your transport element, you have your skills capital. It wasn't a single pot, as it were, which allowed us to properly understand our places and make the integrated investments that would make a difference.
And local priorities.
Absolutely.
What about taxes? Henry, should taxes be part of this devolution?
We would absolutely argue that should be part of it. So fiscal devolution is the kind of next, and I think picking up what Joe said, it's probably much more important than structures actually, but it comes after structure. So I think one of the things that maybe having a mayoral devolution deal should unlock is the ability to levy tax raising powers, because you need a mandate to do that across the geography you're in, to be able to vary taxes. And I think one of the arguments we've made is we need to revisit vehicle excise duty anyway, because it doesn't really work in the electric car era. So whilst you're doing that anyway, why not devolve that to places like the north of England? Because we could do a much better job then
and business
tying
rates,
infrastructure to investment.
Business rates?
Well, I think that one of the challenges with that is also a tax that is disappearing, right? So what you need to do is not just give local councils or those parts of the country the taxes that are disappearing without a plan to reposition them. So I think the future replacement for business rates, I'd be really excited about devolving much more extensively than currently proposed local government. But you need to have some security that you're not...
But in principle, yes to taxation.
My question would be, you need to have a care, because those that are most able to raise tax, if we're talking about reducing disparities, you're in danger of growing disparities.
Tax base.
Because your tax base in certain places is much lower.
Yeah.
And I think we've just got to have a care about how we do that.
Mindful of that. And one last question. I think what I am gathering from everything you said so far, Sir Patrick, and to the questions I've been asking is, you need a long-term strategic view on this, not a...
Absolutely.
Which is what I'm afraid we haven't had, as opposed to what I've been describing as this ad hoc career.
Ultimately, what we're trying to do is attract investment, business investment, and businesses take a long-term strategic view.
Yes.
And then they will invest in local areas that have a clear ambition, have a clear vision.
James, I wish I had a pound for every time the word certainty has been mentioned since I joined this committee.
Mark Pawsey.
To the very first principles, and ask you, why does all this matter? And Joe, you spoke about reducing disparities. Well, does it matter if there are disparities in income between those who live in London and the South East? Those in the North with perhaps a lower income have a better quality of life. You've got wonderful countryside, less congestion. There are people who are moving from London, happy to take a lower income because why is this all important?
So.
Matters because there is an issue that it matters to the nation. Because if you have parts of the country that are less productive, then the whole of the country is less productive. If we have people that are less left behind, they actually cost money to government in support mechanisms, in benefits, etc. So you actually want equality because it's good for the nation. And if we...
But we're not striving for equality, are we?
I mean, economic equality, that we had reduced disparities, it grows the pot, the productive pot for the nation, which actually creates wealth. And I also would argue that an overheated southeast is not good for the people in the greater southeast, and it's also not good for the north. And what you don't want to do is have further acceleration of house prices, more and more long-distance commutes as more and more people move to certain parts of the country. So I actually think it's in the national interest that disparities are reduced. And I think your point about selling the North, Mark, was brilliant. We have got beautiful, affordable locations, a very, very high standard of living, great quality of life. And I think what we do need to do collectively in the North is convince young people that there are brilliant careers to be had in the North. I mentioned earlier, my middle one is actually in the civil service. He believes his career has got to be in London. If we look back even 10 years, there was great civil service regional careers. They've all gone. So I think those things are really important, and very much appreciate you selling us so well. Okay,
James, why are we talking about this?
The reality is, there's a huge cost to the country around health and well-being and all those associated costs. One of the best ways to reduce that is meaningful employment. And that means not minimum wage employment, that means good employment, because it also needs to bring in work poverty as well from that perspective. So whilst you have this disparity, you might have reducing unemployment in the north, but you still have a lot of in-work deprivation and challenges around that. So we need the UK to be driving its productivity. We need the UK to be driving its tax take in real terms to be able to fund everything that we want to do. But we also need to be addressing the health and well-being issues, which means around everybody right across our country having a better quality of life and better standard of living from that perspective. And that means good quality employment right across the country.
And Henry, have you got anything to add?
So I think, my take would be it's the fiscal transfers argument, right? So the point of this was always that Manchester, who was the kind of first to articulate a devolution ambition, were seeking to reduce their dependence on central government and become independent so that they could fund their own services. And nobody in the north wants to be receiving revenue subsidies to deal with the consequences of economic failure, I think, as James argued. What we want is to rebalance the country in the national interest. And actually, so the Power Up the North campaign, which is arguing that the Tory leadership contenders should focus on these issues more, isn't just signed up by 33 regional newspapers in the north, it's also supported by Sir Patrick McLaughlin's previous reference to George Osborne, to his newspaper, to the Evening Standard. And George made a very cogent argument for why the Northern Powerhouse benefits people in London, and it absolutely does, because we have one global city. The Cities Growth Commission showed that cities still generate 61% of the country's wealth, in connection with their hinterlands and the towns and other areas that link to them. But the reality is the only global centre in the north in the country is London. And what we're saying is the north is the UK's second global important destination, not in place of London, so not under the financial services capital, but a strong manufacturing and productive economy that can genuinely contribute to reducing the productivity gap. Because those 850,000 jobs we can create if we transform the north will be significantly more productive than the jobs that are being created in all our cities and regions at the moment. Because what you're seeing at the moment is productivity is going down, not up. And that's because we're not creating productive enough jobs. You have to back a vision like the Northern Powerhouse if you're going to address that.
Thank you to each of you, because I thought it was quite important to get on record as to why we're actually in this room talking about this particular topic. The government's principal tool for that, and Joe, you spoke about it and you've been involved with 3 of them, I think, is local enterprise partnerships. Are they working?
I think, genuinely, that local enterprise partnerships are doing a phenomenal job given the resources. When local enterprise partnerships were set up, Stephen's point around frameworks, it was very much let 1,000 flowers bloom. So every area was very, very different, and that was the expectation. Over time, and certainly through the Strengthened Local Enterprise Partnerships report, all LEPs are now operating to a consistent framework. Yes,
isn't it the case that some are doing a cracking job, but others really haven't yet got their act together after 8 years?
I would hope that everyone has got their act together.
We'd all hope that, but you've been involved in 3. Why did you move from one to another? What's the difference between the LEPs you've worked in?
Cheshire and Warrington, when I went to Cheshire and Warrington, it was to establish the LEP and to start their strategic development and to start their structures. And I was doing that as part of something I was doing for local government at the time. I then went to Northamptonshire and we did meet there, Mark, and very much about high growth area, one of the fastest growing places in the country, very exciting agenda. We were the first LEP in the country to merge with SEMLEP, and at that point I decided it was time to go back to the north. And in Northamptonshire I would say we did a fabulous job, really, really good stuff. We were 3 national pilots. We had unemployment at the lowest level. We piloted the new Enterprise Advisors Programme, which was subsequently rolled out nationally. In Cumbria, I came to a very different LEP, a LEP that needed, I would call, significant transformation. So that's what I've been working on over the past 12 months. It is now, I would say, a very good LEP. Our local industrial strategy was produced and submitted to government at the end of March, even though we weren't even slotted to be anywhere near that. We've got really good governance in place. We've got a very, very big governance structure that works with all of our businesses and all of our wider partners, and a very, very clear programme of work as to what we want to do. So for me, LEPs have done an excellent job. They cost government £19 million a year for every LEP in the country. That is extremely lean. And my only frustration is that I and my LEP could do so much more if we had integrated finance and probably a bit more surety about our organisational funding.
Right, but there's no external audit of LEPs, I don't think. You say they're all operating well. There may be some businesses in some areas who would say, well, what has my LEP done for me? So should there be an external audit in the same way we've got Ofsted or something like that?
I mean, what we've been looking at within the LEPs is moving and agreeing with government to a peer review process, and James can talk about that because he's been one of the peer LEPs that's been involved. So similar to the kind of thing that Local Government Association does on peer review. In addition, all LEPs have either got to be part of a combined authority or they've got to be a company. So in terms of external review, we will be subject to the standard company audit procedures. In addition to that,
So you said you will be. So we're saying after 8 years, there's been no effective audit on them.
Each LEP was a requirement of strengthened local enterprise partnerships last year was that every LEP had to become a company. And there was a few LEPs in the country that weren't, including the one that I had taken over 14 months ago. My previous LEP in Northamptonshire had audited accounts, an annual general meeting, annual report every year for years. So all of those things.
I think we would have all assumed that was a natural thing to happen for all LEPs. So you're saying that's not the case?
It is now, yeah.
But it hasn't been?
It's not been everywhere, okay. But I think, recognising that we've moved LEPs from being a very, loose set of organisations into something that is now very, very clear about its governance, its accountability, its transparency. All LEPs are either a combined authority or they're a company. And, I would go back to my start point. I think LEPs have done a phenomenal job. They've made great progress delivering growth deal. They've done it in partnership. They've engaged business very well. And they've done it with very, very limited resources.
And we've heard the view expressed that there are too many LEPs and some of them are too small to be effective. A good example might be Coventry and Warwickshire, which is my LEP, which is, I think, the smallest in the country. Do you agree with that there are too many and that there should be some mergers, or do you think the ability for LEPs to form their own economic geography has led to us having the right number?
I think it goes back to my point that we get overly hung up on structure. It's very good if we have clear lines, etc. But the bit for me is about the functioning geography. Cumbria, you could say, is a small LEP in population terms, but in geographic terms, it's half of the northwest of England. And it's not one place, you know, it's a genuine polycentric economy. I've got 9 sector panels because there are that many real sectors that operate in place. I also look at my geography, it's the most self-contained geography in England. 96% of people live and work there. So we could say, well, you know, you've only got 500,000 people, but I'm not convinced that and being dispassionate about it, that their needs would be better served merging with somewhere else because of the scope of the economy, the geographic breadth. I do think ours is right size and we are arguably a small LEP.
And James, your LEP, is it the right size? Are you effective? And are your boundaries the appropriate ones?
Well, we're a LEP that has significant overlaps. So with regard to the Strengthening Local Enterprises Review, we're going through a period of change which requires us to get rid of those overlaps. So we have East Riding, which overlaps with the Humber, and we have York, Harrogate, Craven and Selby, which overlap with Leeds City Region from that perspective. We've had to take a very pragmatic approach to how we move forward. Functionally, you can't separate Hull and East Riding. It just doesn't make any economic sense to do that. So we've accepted that Hull are part of the Humber LEP, so we've got to let East Riding go that way, which leaves us with York and North Yorkshire. Now, straight lines don't work in functional geographies. I'm afraid business operates on what makes sense to business, and whether we like that or not. So York, Harrogate, Craven and Selby absolutely have strong links to Leeds City Region and the West Yorkshire conurbation, but equally they are major drivers of the whole of the North Yorkshire economy from that perspective. So the overlap made a lot of sense, and actually the way we operated a LEP, we made it work. We collaborate with Leeds where it makes sense. We have joint programmes where it makes sense. Where things are localised issues, we focus on them ourselves. We're currently in discussions with Leeds around how a merged LEP between the two will happen. But the reality is there are only 2 practical options. One is one very large LEP. Then you have to separate the governance, which can understand a large conurbation alongside. I've got 2 national parks and a coastline. So you've got hugely deeply rural and the coast and the issues that come with that. So you either have a large LEP with governance which then understands the separate issues, or we will have 2 separate LEPs and then a formal collaboration around how we work on that overlap together. Okay. And that's the discussions that we're going through at the moment. Both ourselves and Leeds have really strong governance. Okay. But Leeds has governance which is suitable for an urban environment. We have governance which is suitable for a rural environment. And actually marrying those 2 up is not that straightforward.
And James, what's the budget for your LEP?
The operating budget.
Yeah.
So the contribution from government is on an annual basis half a million, but it's about 1.8 million.
And how much do you allocate on behalf of government? What's the spend you put into the
So the capital spend, it varies year on year, but our growth deal was £140 million over the 5-year period.
I want to ask you about accountability. So you're responsible for allocating £140 million.
Yeah.
Joe's just told us that until recently, some LEPs had never been audited. Yeah. What are the audit arrangements for your LEP?
So our accountable body is North Yorkshire County Council. They have independent auditors, Veritao, who are they're completely independent of the council. They audit us on an annual basis. We equally have the annual.
For how many years have you been audited?
We since we got the money.
Since inception.
Yeah.
Have I got the wrong end of the stick there, Joe?
I was going to say, can I clarify that? We were talking about the running costs of the businesses as opposed to the growth deal funding. That's right. Growth deal funding, Mark, has been audited every year.
Right.
Yeah.
That's audited. The money doesn't actually flow into the organisation. It goes to our accountable body. And the accountable body, which will be a local authority, needs to go through all of their standards practices for dealing with the grants funding.
Thank you, Chair.
So very, very highly audited and regulated.
Thank you. Vernon Coker.
Thanks, Chair. Can I just, James and Joe, just get... So it's very interesting what you're saying. Can I just ask, just probe a little bit more what Mark Palsy said, just with this question. Without combined authorities or elected mayors, do you have the capacity to do and strategic direction, really, to do the work that's expected of you? And just to, if I may, just to put that question together. So you form the MP11 group. Isn't that, in a sense, that goes to the heart of the problem, that you want to be local, which, of course, I totally accept that. You need the local input. But you also have this challenge of the MP11 has been formed because you need a bigger, more coordinated response strategically for you to deliver what you need to. Is that fair or unfair? Is that?
I think it's about right decisions at the right level. So some things absolutely make sense to do at the North of England level. The strategic transport, trade and investment, innovation. If you look at innovation, it's not about connecting a business to your local university. It's about connecting a business to the university that is best in whatever sector that they operate in from that perspective. So issues like that, it makes sense to either collaborate formally through a Northern Powerhouse model or informally, and that will always happen. However, actually, to be effective across the whole of the north of England, you also need to reflect on where decisions are very local, and you require the local engagement of stakeholders to be able to make a difference. And actually, lots of the skills issues, that's very true. The housing market, that's absolutely true. And actually, a lot of the business and the business opportunities, you need to be able to engage with businesses at a local level to understand the opportunities and how you can make a real difference.
So is the argument then you need a two-tier devolution structure there?
Yes, in real terms. Yeah. It's decisions at the right level. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
And would totally support that. I mean, what LEPs are about is looking at all of the determinants of growth in their place. And some issues will clearly go up. So, cross-regional transport, we'll be working collaboratively. Innovation in sort of key themes, it makes sense for us to work collectively. If we have got disparities, it makes sense for the North to come together to actually highlight what those key policy issues are, how we want to work with government, how we want to create a voice, how we want to sell ourselves outside of the UK. That matters at a northern level, but at the place-based level, it's got to be at a lower level of geography. Yeah. The Northern Powerhouse isn't going to resolve intergenerational worklessness in Whitehaven. That's got to be very, very localised, and it's got to be created by people who really know and understand their place, who've got the right relationships to get the whole machinery to operate differently. And you asked about capacity and capability. Looking around, I was talking to one of my LEP colleagues who's got the biggest growth deal settlement in the country. His team is probably about twice as big as the committee team here. So, we are leanly resourced, but we're doing a very good job. And that's because it's not just about the LEP team, it's about the entirety of places coming together to make this happen. So my local industrial strategy was written through a 7-stage consultation process with all of our partners. So it's widely owned. The development of the work programme to make it happen, again, is through all of our governance. So it's widely owned. And we're looking for individual organisations all to do their bit to make it happen. Okay. So for me, it's about how do we mobilise the machinery and bring everyone together to change places. Okay,
I want to move on to local industrial strategies, but I think James will.
I think just on the capacity issue, I think the danger with the LEPs is that because they are successful, because they give government a reach to a very local level, that they initially resource to do a job, but because they're doing that well, they then get additional asks. And there is this constant putting on and can LEPs do this? Can you consult on that? Can you respond to this? And that's what becomes the drain. If you're in a business, you focus on what your core objective is, and you do that objective and you do it really, really well. The key for LEPs to be successful with a limited resource is to be very focused about what their role is and to resource them to do that, but then not expect them to be all things to all people. Yeah.
Thank you both very much for that. Henry, on the local industrial strategies, I mean, Greater Manchester was in the first 3, I think. So on a very practical, rather than a sort of theoretical, we ought to have local industrial strategies. What's the difference? What practically happens that will drive growth and jobs across the whole of Greater Manchester in a way that wouldn't happen now? I mean, what are the practical implications of it, rather than this is a good thing? Do you see what I mean?
I think, so the kind of the principle that you would have in their case, an independent prosperity review that would tell you the problems in Greater Manchester's economy, so that they have this employment that's becoming less productive, that if you added more people getting a qualification, so if you halve the number with no qualifications, you increase productivity overnight by 2%. It's very useful to know those things because they focus you. And I think
why would you need a local industrial strategy to do that?
So the point is, if you know what your problems really are, then when you go to government and say, we think we should invest money in, say, in their case, making sure the health economy keeps people in work and productive for longer, that they come up with a way of delivering, say, full fibre and 5G infrastructure ahead of time, all by 2040, along with becoming carbon neutral. The reality is that's based on some evidence that it's going to make a positive difference. Because I think there is sometimes a problem that in areas people say, oh, I'd like to do a project or do something, and there's no evidence to back up that it would actually make an impact. So the argument with government has always been, well, oh, why would we give you this money? Because we don't know it'll make any difference. So if you have a consistent evidence base that says what the challenges are, and then a clear plan about how you're going to fix them, then rather than having this kind of amorphous government kind of strategy and approach to the grand challenges that says you can somehow do it all from Whitehall, actually you start to understand that actually when it comes to health innovation, and particularly manufacturing in materials, which is obviously a big strength at Manchester University, then Manchester is the place that can lead that agenda. So you also start to tie together, well, if I'm making a national investment in, say, materials, I should be thinking about doing it in Manchester. And historically, George Osborne as Chancellor did those things from the context of policy making sort of day to day. What local industrial strategies are, I think, and particularly the attempt by Greg Clark to make this work, because it isn't just a northern thing, it's a national endeavour, is it's starting to make that the way of doing things rather than relying on a particularly committed politician to make it happen, so that the civil servants in the system are geared up to enable places to attract the right levels of funding to make the difference that I know the Chair and the committee as a whole would want us to make, rather than on every single issue having to go to war and say, oh, but this is the right thing for Manchester. Well, actually, some of these things are being relitigated time and time again. Actually, if government accepts that the way to make Manchester's economy is to do the local industrial strategy, then that means every bit of money that Manchester gets, they prioritise for that. And when you're looking at what powers and funding to devolve, you give places the responsibility for the things that will make a difference. And I think that's what the local industrial strategy does give you, is the evidence that you're making the right investments and certainty to government that this will have the payback that will, in the end, reduce that fiscal transfer and be good value for money for the UK taxpayer, not just for the citizens of the individual places.
Okay, thanks. Just coming to Joe and James, so how far advanced are you with respect to your local industrial strategies, and is that,
We've submitted our local industrial strategy to government. That went in at the end of March.
You've been worried a bit about the process of this, haven't you, I think?
Sorry?
You've been worried a bit about the process of who's been gone first and so on, haven't you, a little bit?
I think I've got a slight concern, because we were clear that we were going to have our strategy ready for the end of March for submission, but we were not prioritising a wave until wave 3. So clearly we've got to wait for us to be formally into the system, and hopefully this week our evidence base was being formally considered, and we will then start the negotiation process.
Sorry to interrupt. What's the timescale for you knowing whether you've been successful?
We now enter a basic, what I would call a co-production process with government, where they take our local product and work through with us to create it to be, a daughter document of the national industrial strategy. And very quickly, the question you asked about the value of the industrial strategy. For me, the big difference with the industrial strategy vis-à-vis its predecessor, the Strategic Economic Plan, is they are genuinely socio-economic, as opposed to the set being hard economics. They are less bid documents, because clearly the set was very tied into the growth deal. These are about a much more holistic view of how do you change your economies and change your places.
So this is a very fundamental point, just to make sure I understood. So the difference now is that it's a socio-economic model of growth rather than just an economic model of growth.
Yeah.
So that's
it's
really interesting.
About
health inequalities, carbon footprints, all of those sorts of things as well. Yes.
Absolutely.
So have I understood you correctly?
I mean, our strategy operates on twin platforms: productivity and inclusive growth.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, just James.
James,
The
fact that the place is such an important part of the industrial strategy, and I know it's been identified as one of the foundations of growth, but place is at the heart, and it comes back to Joe's point. If you properly understand a place, you need to understand all the socio-economic factors. We're slightly behind Joe, obviously, because of the merge. We were put into wave 3, so we'll be ours will be complete and submitted to government by December this year. From that perspective, whether that's joint with Leeds or not from that perspective. I think the reason why local industrial strategies are so important is the larger geography you go to. A simple rule of maths is that the numbers aggregate around the largest settlement and the largest agglomeration. So if you operate at a very large geography, you lose the distinctiveness of local places because you average out in... So if we merge with Leeds and we were to look at house prices, earnings to house prices, it would be just over 6 collectively. Actually, in Leeds it's 6. For us, it's 9 and 10 multipliers in certain places. So the law of maths means that if you get to the wrong geography, you lose what is distinct and unique about local places.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Albert Owen.
Thank you. If I could move on to the UK Shared Prosperity Fund and ask the three of you, what do you think should be the key features of that fund? Starts with you, James. Key features.
I think that ultimately the focus has got to be delivering the local industrial strategy. We are writing strategies which are a long-term vision and a long-term plan on how to drive prosperity in our places. The shared prosperity should be as flexible as possible to deliver the priorities that come out within those local industrial strategies. And like I say, what we don't want is we don't want a shared prosperity fund, which is a set of very siloed pots of money which have to do specific things, because it will be very different in the Yorkshire Dales, what I need to do, to what it would be on the Yorkshire coast or what it would be in the middle of Leeds or Manchester. So a pot of money which can be shaped around the socio-economic needs of our places is critical. I think the timing is the other big concern that we've got. Okay. So we are currently running 2 programmes, the Capital Programme, Local Growth Fund and the EU, both of which come to an end in 2021.
Okay. So the key feature for you is the alignment with industrial strategies.
Absolutely.
Okay, we'll come on to funding
yes.
and various periods. Joe.
For me, lots of lessons that we can learn. The first thing is we need a funding pot that is both capital and revenue, because frequently the revenue funding is doing the catalytic stuff that we currently struggle to deliver. We've got to have some certainty on funding allocations so that we're looking at 5 years, which allows us to develop proper investment plans. Want to guard against excessive bidding processes that just consume lots of time and energy. It's the investing strategy point. We need to be thinking seriously about the formula for distribution and how we get that balance right between need and opportunity. We've got to have some flexibility on annual funding profiles, not rigid ones.
Sure.
There's
an awful lot there, but I mean, again, it's the alignment with the industrial strategy, because it's out to consultation now. Have you, as local enterprise partnerships, been involved in that consultation, and are you speaking with one voice? Because if we had a disparity of opinions coming from the different LEPs, it's going to be very difficult for the fund to work.
The Shared Prosperity Fund, we've been working closely with government colleagues. So we've had, through our network, regular
The consultation has started, am I correct in saying that? Officially?
To be honest, last time I checked, and it's very recently, it hadn't yet opened. We were told summer, and
yes.
we've missed it in
I'm
the
told
last
in
couple
Wales
of
there's
days.
been targeted forums for this, and that's part of the consultation. Henry, what do you think?
I think there's lots of concerns, Albert, that colleagues are pointing out. I think I'd just sum it up by saying what you really want, if you believe in economic rebalancing, is you can't determine this from Westminster. So one of the big worries, obviously, is the pot will get smaller, because a lot of this EU money that's being repatriated is being promised for other things, right? So what will be the total funding envelope? There's also a little bit of jiggery-pokery where lots of funding streams that were not part of the current funding streams are being counted as being a part of the Shared Prosperity Fund. So there's a lot of, I would say, kind of questionable maths from the department, because essentially what they're trying to do is reduce the amount they give people whilst making sure that it doesn't look like they're really reducing it by very much. And I think that is a little bit, I think that's not fair. And I think there's a challenge about the Northern Powerhouse, that if you're serious about it, the places in the country that receive the most are almost exclusively in the north of England. So Tees Valley is number 2, the North East is number 3 per head. And the reality is, if you were to, and those like the Joseph Rowntree Foundation have made this case as well, if you were to sort of split this money equally across areas and sort of do it by capita, then you would see massive funding reductions in the north of England. And so the challenge about creating a Northern Powerhouse is if you do the Shared Prosperity Fund wrong, then what you may end up creating is a significant impairment on the ability to close the productivity gap whilst you're supposedly investing in other projects. Okay. So I think there needs to be a Northern Powerhouse lens to the Shared Prosperity Fund, and I think it would be a very easy thing, I think, for an incoming Prime Minister to guarantee that the North's overall allocation would be at least
and when
as
you mean
much
the
as
north,
the previous
you're
funding
talking
streams.
north of England, of course. There's also Scotland,
Yeah.
Northern Ireland and Wales. You know, it's a UK shared
And I
prosperity
think the
fund.
challenge is, I think that the regions and nations will have some protection because of the reality of how Barnet and other formulas work. What I'm most concerned is that perhaps those in the shires in the south will say, well, we didn't get any money from EU money, or we got fractions of money, we want a bit more. And the reality is, if you reduce the total pot and give everyone a bit of jam, and spread the jam, then there'll be nothing left for the most challenging areas of the country. And I think those of us in the north will not accept that.
My next question. You know, it's currently based on need. Do you think it should be continue to be so, or should there be opportunities as well? Should there be two funds, you know, split for dynamic innovation and also helping the needy in rural areas of Cumbria, for instance?
I mean, and we've got to think very carefully about how it fits with other funding pots. We've got to think about what's going to happen in CSR, because if we look at if we look at transport funding per head, you know, London and the Greater South East is far better than the North. So I think we've got to start with the Shared Prosperity Fund has got to be used within the context of the much wider government funding envelope. And as Henry says, we've got to make sure that we don't find areas in the North that have been significant beneficiaries from European funds actually having that money cut down when we're trying to reduce national disparities.
And you know, just to remind the committee, of course, the EU social funds had match funding from London as well as from Whitehall, so it wasn't, you know, it was a big package, and it drew down from Westminster as well. James, you mentioned about timescales have to be correct, etc. I mean, the current EU structural funds are based on a 7-year period. Do you think it should be extended to a 10-year period and have a longer sort of focus?
Well, at the end of the day, the hardest thing is when you have a cliff edge and we fall off a cliff edge, and then you have to start from scratch and we get momentum. So LEPs across the country have been working really hard to get momentum. And if you take the local growth fund element, which is a capital programme, anyone who is running a capital programme knows that you have to overcommit in order to deliver your targets. Yeah. You have to overprofile. Well, we're currently in a situation where we're now 20 months from the end of that programme, which is hard to move capital money about. No certainty what comes beyond. Who was going to take that risk of me overprofiling? If I know that if I don't overprofile, I'll probably miss my target. And
so are you confident it's going to be in place by 2020?
I'm not confident it's going to be in place by 2020, but something needs to be in place to bridge that gap. We need to be able to deliver. You know, it's fundamental that the local growth fund money that's been allocated is making a huge difference, and we need to make sure that continues to be delivered.
Plug the gap, make sure there's no sort of cliff edge at
right.
2019, and 2020 there's a fund for an extended period. Is that what you think, Chair?
And I was going to say, in addition to what James has said, momentum really matters. We're not going to get people developing programmes, developing projects when there is no surety and certainty on funding, because that costs a lot of money. And, you know, if we think about the changes that may happen in our economic environment over the next 12, 18 months, it's really important that we've got momentum and that we're doing everything we can to move growth forward.
Okay. On the same question, but two additional questions, and others can comment on them as well, about how the impact of the funds can be measured. And again, can you deal, Henry, with what James said about the possibility of no funding gaps?
So I think the point, isn't it, is that if you, and I think that some of the things in the old SEFs are still relevant actually, because you don't want to lose that lens on what you're doing. But I think what I would argue is that if you've got significantly more powers going to places, then what comes with that is enhanced accountability, right, locally. And so the thing I would argue against, for instance, is an application element to these funds. I think they should be based on a needs allocation and then allocated directly to places. I don't think any of it should be left back for bidding. And the example that was set by Stronger Towns, which is a pretty derisory pot of money in terms of its scale, of having a bidding element is not something we would suggest should be repeated. And I think there's been a lot of people worried that some of the less attractive elements of the Stronger Towns Fund will be replicated in the Shared Prosperity Fund because we haven't seen the consultation yet, as colleagues have said. So I think if you have got that genuine local accountability, you need to trust communities and stakeholders to hold, whether it be LEPs or LEPs in the context of combined authorities, to account. And there are, as been discussed, pretty robust governance structures in place for doing that. I don't think having a set of government targets for what Shared Prosperity Fund is for is a good idea.
But one of the criticisms of European structural funds is there isn't proper monitoring and measuring of how the funds are spent. Do you agree with that?
I think that you can have a framework for identifying what money's being spent on, but I think my argument would be that if you put strings on funding streams, then what you tend to find is they're used less effectively, and you can't allocate them to the
Can you just finish
I
off,
think is
Henry,
best.
if you don't mind, by saying whether you've been part of the consultation, formally part of the consultation?
So we will be making our representations to BEIS and to colleagues at MHCLG through the process.
Thank you.
Drew Hendry.
In terms of other current sources of funding, how has the take-up been of the British Business Bank's Northern Powerhouse Fund?
In Cumbria, exceptional. We've actually spent, very, very small allocation. We only had 2 million to begin with, but that's been spent and we're working to bring more of the funding in.
I think it's learnt the lessons of some of its predecessors. So I think some of the predecessors were very strong in the cities, or the big cities, and not particularly effective elsewhere. I think, to be fair to NPIF, actually it's been really successful in the Humber and getting across there, and actually York and such like has done really well. I think the deeply rural areas has been more of a challenge, but that's as much around demand as it is around supply from that perspective. So actually I think NPIF generally has made steps forward, but you can always improve, and obviously improve the reach from that perspective.
It's worth saying the private sector have also come in and put in their own funds alongside it. So Barclays, for instance, have their own now dedicated Northern Powerhouse fund alongside NPIF and open to blending that with the public money. So I think the private sector has responded very positively to it, and that's one of the reasons why Roger Marsh, as well as chairing MP11, who chairs that group, I think there's a strong case for continuing NPIF beyond its current lifespan.
Perhaps you could just outline what's the criteria for accessing those funds?
Basic European eligibility criteria, Drew. So it's got to be about the size of the business, the sector of the business, the eligibility of the activity, and then any businesses that meet the criteria can come forward.
It's broadly underserved segments, so it's
Yeah.
people who would struggle without that money to unlock either the whole funding package or any of it.
Okay, well, given that point, some of the investment we know comes from pooling EU funding. What will happen if the MPIF doesn't have those funds available?
MPIF, and clearly this is a question really to us, British Business Bank. MPIF is meant to be a revolving fund, so that funds that are there
But
originally will come back in.
After the UK leaves the EU, those funds won't be available. Those EU funds won't be available. So what will happen?
You're right. So the way the revolving funds work is you invest your money up to a date, and then you have a period of years while
money comes back
in. If there isn't anything to replace it, you're going to have several years where you're not able to make reinvestments. And again, it comes back to the previous thing of momentum, brand awareness, reach, and getting you lose all those things. So we would strongly recommend that it's maintained.
And the government's patient capital review does set out what some of the replacement funding streams could be for previous European investment bank funds.
Okay.
So that is the source of where that money will need to come from. But it comes back to what a future Chancellor will commit in the coming budgets. And not what will now be a CSR in likely this year. There will have to be provision made to do that as a decision. At the moment, it does have an end date, and that end date hasn't been extended yet.
Okay. And James, you were talking earlier about the cliff edge, and both you and Joe have talked about the impact on momentum that's required earlier. Have you quantified, if the Shared Prosperity Fund doesn't come in and doesn't perform the function that you've just outlined, have you quantified what impact that will have?
It's hard to quantify at the moment because there's such uncertainty around what the shared prosperity fund is even going to be. So we monitor our performance and the performance of our economy really closely from that perspective, and we continue to do that, and we know where we're making our investments. The exact impact of nothing coming in, as it were, we haven't quantified that at the moment.
But what do you think would happen if that's not replaced in time? What's your feeling about it?
My view is it will be very, very difficult because the only finance that is currently visible and available to fund for local industrial strategies is that finance. So if that's not available, it's what tools are we going to use to make the strategy a reality? We'll do lots of things locally to bring people together to mobilise certain things, but some parts of it will need pump priming funding. So we're looking at those challenges. Cumbria has been identified as one of the most vulnerable places in the country to a no-deal Brexit, given the shape of our economy. I would be extremely concerned if we weren't in a position very quickly to have tools and techniques available, particularly to support our farming and visitor economy communities.
And just to clarify as a final question, you've had no information about what might be coming to replace those funds?
No.
None at all.
We've had conversations, genuine
But
conversations with colleagues in
Yeah.
government about what
Yeah.
they're looking at, how they're looking at structure in the funds, what kind of features we want to see, which is the point we were feeding through to Albert. So we've genuinely had the opportunity to feed in our thoughts, but we've not yet seen the formal consultation.
And would you say it's critical that you now know that?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Probably.
absolutely.
Thank
Stephen Kerr.
Yeah, anyway, I was really pleased you mentioned the patient capital review and the... It's the wrong committee, but it's an area that interests me unendingly because there is a lack of government response to that review, which they themselves, of course, commission. Stronger Towns Fund was touched upon earlier. Joe, you were quite positive about it, but what do you know about it?
In terms of Stronger Towns, we had the initial, this is what it's going to do, these are the initial amounts of money. We were told informally that it was going to be formulaic and that there was a view about the formula that would be used. Since then, to be honest, Stephen, it's gone very, very quiet. We have raised concerns in the consultation about the size and scale, because for Cumbria, if we're looking at a certain size threshold, many of our towns wouldn't be eligible. So we want to be clear that some of the areas that could most benefit and most need it from
They qualify. Yeah.
I
was going to say the top slice is pretty annoying as well, though. So the reality is it's less generous. If you do the maths based on the formula as it was currently announced, places would get a lot more if it hadn't got a national bidding part in it. And I think that's one of the real issues with how government has approached it, which is that there's still an element for government ministers to be able to pick favourite projects, right, or favourite areas. And that doesn't do anything for people's faith in the system being about genuinely rebalancing the economy, because whether or not you happen to be in favour in government or whether you're at the right party shouldn't really impact whether your place gets any money. And I think leaving a degree of area where perhaps a future Secretary of State, I don't think Greg Clark would do this, would have the ability to maybe make decisions that weren't based on the evidence, I think is unfortunate, because I think lots of people would trust Greg to approach that scheme with only the best intentions, but by leaving that area of discretion, the way that the Secretary of State who eventually launched it, James Brokenshire, who didn't design it, has built in a degree of, I would argue, as well as the derisory amount of money involved, it just doesn't fit what we actually need. The challenges around dealing with the causes of Brexit, not just the consequences, is massively bigger than
You're both concerned about what you don't know about it.
Yeah.
Is the short answer. James?
Yeah, so I would back up what's said, but there's a particular point that it's aimed at your larger towns. So we welcome the move from a pure city focus to a focus of cities and towns from that perspective. But in a very large rural area as we are, the majority of our towns fall below the threshold of which the primary source will that be. So I think across North Yorkshire there are only two towns kind of fall within that threshold.
But it's another fund, and it's another set of criteria, it's another set of applications. I mean, does the rather cluttered landscape when it comes to this whole area, is that a hindrance or a help? I think I know the answer.
Yeah,
I'm leading the witness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely a hindrance from that perspective, in that they're all slightly different. They all have slightly different criteria. They all have a slightly different focus.
Yeah.
And they all have a significant cost, both time and money, in bidding from that perspective.
Yeah.
So ultimately, what we're trying to deliver across the UK is more prosperous, more distinctly successful places. And yet it comes back to Joe's earlier point about everything is very siloed in how we approach it.
Yeah.
Actually, what we want a pot of money which is about understanding place and delivering successful place across the UK from that perspective.
Joe, can you say a bit more about the cost that goes into making application for these types of funds, and also the cluttered landscape? At least that's
I think the start point, Stephen, is that we should be investing in strategy, not getting single pots of money, because then it becomes a distraction. I mean, I think the thing for me is that it also depends on the process, because there are different capacities and capabilities in many places, particularly in smaller places. So you may find that the well-oiled machine is far better able to access the funding than some areas that may desperately need it. Whereas a strategy approach actually evens that out, because the evidence has identified the target areas. So it clearly takes time in terms of individual areas compiling the evidence base, doing the thought process in terms of how do they meet the eligibility criteria, spending time gathering the buy-in of partners to the proposal. All of these things consume significant time, and as Henry
If you don't have the
said,
resources to start with, you're at a competitive disadvantage.
well, the bidding process may not be through a LEP. Our role in this in Stronger Towns is not defined,
No.
so it's likely to come from local authorities.
Well, it's not defined.
It's
I
not
think that's
defined.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's it.
Sorry,
Yeah,
no,
I just want to ask a general question to the three of you. You mentioned, Joe, about learning from the lessons from on the Shared Prosperity Fund, for example. Do you have much coordination with the devolved administrations about best practice and some of the pitfalls that they've had since the evolution in the 20 years ago now?
Being very honest, the only real link we've had is through Borderlands, where we are working with the Borderlands Inclusive Growth Deal, where we're working with the top end north of England and south of Scotland. So we've not had any more formal, other than the experience of working together on that and thinking how can we work on certain
it's
issues
just
like
we're celebrating
skills.
20 years of devolution in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and I'm somebody who wanted it earlier in England as well, and I always believe in decentralisation, and yet I think it would be a good idea if you were all to meet up and share your experiences. Henry, do you have any?
So we have very active links with those respective organisations, as you might imagine, partly because we sort of, a bit like as was being described, take a wider view of the North, right? So the economic North includes North Wales. I would argue the government's Northern Powerhouse strategy goes to Anglesey, right? So you're not an English MP, but the Northern Powerhouse is as much about you as it is about anyone else in terms of your community. And the same is true, actually, of those links on issues like transport, where clearly you need to work collaboratively across the different subnational bodies that have been created. So I think we're doing a piece of work on devolution at the moment for publication later this year, and we're absolutely looking at the lessons from devolution in other parts of the UK, because we think that's an important part of how you make the next step in terms of the types of accountability structures you would need for much more significant devolution.
Thanks, and James, who represents a continent in Yorkshire.
Of course, absolutely. So again, our primary links are through Northern Powerhouse and the NP at that level. From that perspective, I'm very interested in how the Borderlands deal actually works, and that genuinely crosses between the both, and to understand how that governance works, because that could be quite relevant for Yorkshire from that point of view. So I think thank you very much. Lesson to be learned.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a really good start to this inquiry, and I think as the inquiry progresses, we'll learn more about other parts of the country as well, and also ensure that this inquiry also would take in visits to other parts of the country to see some of the fantastic work you're doing, although, of course, the work that's happening on devolution in Yorkshire is very close to my heart as a Leeds MP, and the sooner we can get on with that and deliver the devolution that we want to see, the better from my perspective. But thank you to the three of you for giving evidence this morning. We look forward to working more closely with you in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Order.